Hi, Pete. How are you?
Good, good. How are you? Let me get things started with the kind of big picture question of the topic. So can you tell us a little bit about the scope of this incredibly empirically rich book, the Wuhan Lockdown, and maybe just a little bit of details of exactly what you decided to cover in its 9 chapters?
Thanks, Pete. Just first want to thank you for having me for this occasion, and it's always a pleasure to see you and have conversations with you. I've always admired your work on the sociology of emotions and their important political implications. So about the book, at the basic level, I really wanted to capture how one nation responded to a really a very dangerous crisis at a moment when people knew very little about it, and there was still a lot of uncertainty, and how that triggered responses at the level of government policy making, as well as on the grassroots. On the grassroots, how citizens responded to government policies and how citizens themselves responded to the situation, the crisis situation. So that's how I structured the chapters, the 9 chapters. I didn't come out with the idea of the 9 chapters immediately. I followed the events of the Wuhan lockdown as they were unfolding in the spring of 2020. My first initial plan was, I think I had a plan to write 6 chapters, but as the events unfolded, I added more chapters. But mostly, the first few chapters provided some context, historical background, as well as government policy, government mobilization. But most of the book, the rest of the chapters, really focused on how citizens responded in many different ways: civic organizing, support for people in Wuhan, self-mobilization on the part of Wuhan residents through personal writing, and patients, doctors. So a variety of responses that we see from different walks of life.
Terrific. Thank you for the kind words, by the way. That's very kind of you. I do think we have quite a bit of overlapping interests in the sociology and politics of emotion. Can you tell us a little bit about why you thought this topic needed to be written about?
Well, as soon as the lockdown started, I was in Philadelphia, and immediately I thought of the SARS situation in 2003. And of course, people on social media in China were also thinking of the SARS situation. So I wanted to read a little bit about the SARS. I searched quite desperately for both academic and non-academic writings about the SARS in 2003. There was a little bit, I found a little bit, but not much. And I found that, I thought this was a great pity that 2003 at the time was such an unprecedented event as well. I remember still footage of television footage of lockdown in Beijing hospitals from 2003. I think at the beginning of 2020, when people felt that Wuhan lockdown was such an unprecedented kind of experience, that was the same kind of response people had in 2003. But there was not that much documentation from that earlier history. So I immediately realized that I wanted as much as possible to at least to document some of these events. And it just happens that as soon as the lockdown started, Wuhan residents began to post their lockdown diaries, and so many of them appeared on social media. I immediately realized that these were the most precious, the prime data source for a social scientist, really. And I've always preferred to use this kind of documents for my own research. Even when I was working on my book on the Red God generation, I used diaries of the Sandown youth. I used their letters. I like these personal documents that were produced in a very moment of the historical events. So I started trying to follow these diaries authors, and then to try to save as many of them as possible. And of course, I spent a lot of time reading these diaries. I just realized very quickly they were so rich and would be really valuable material for me to write about.
Yeah, so let's follow up on that a little bit. It really is striking about this book, the bottom-up approach. So much of what we have followed outside of China certainly is kind of the macro top-down Beijing-centric story, even of the story of Wuhan. And yet what is really striking about this book is how you pay attention to individual Chinese stories. And you really tell the story of the Wuhan lockdown from the bottom up. Sometimes even one story at a time, in a way reminding me of some histories and museums about the Holocaust, where they purposely reject the kind of macro view to insist on viewing the issue in order to be able to fully take it in at the individual level. So perhaps you could talk just a little bit about what drove you to really focus on individual Chinese voices.
Yeah, there are a number of considerations. I started when I started thinking about the possibility of writing a book. I immediately decided that would be my approach, to focus on the voices of ordinary people and how they experience the pandemic. Partly because, as a sociologist working on activism, social movements, I've always looked at the experiences of people on the ground. Partly also because I know that there will be others who will be writing the kind of narratives, top-down narratives in their own ways. I don't have to worry about them. Actually, we see already, not long after the lockdown started, two kinds of narratives appearing. One, in Chinese media discourse, there was an official narrative of the Wuhan lockdown. As the lockdown unfolded, I think there was more of a conscientious, deliberate attempt to project a narrative of the lockdown in the Chinese media discourse. And on the other side, where I am in the American Western media discourse, we see sort of the other side of the narrative, also mostly top down. There was some great reporting about what was happening on the ground in Wuhan, but mostly the focus was on elite politics, policy level, and the voices of the ordinary people, which were rich and diverse and extremely powerful, do not feature prominently in either of these two, let's say, temporarily, let's call them two kinds of master narratives that were being projected deliberately or not deliberately, but they were taking shape in some way. And I would like to offer that wealth of voices of the ordinary people. So that's another consideration. I guess, you know, I could go on and say a little bit more about why. As you see, I have the title of today's talk is an absolutely ordinary person. We see another kind of narrative being produced by Wuhan residents themselves. So this title actually is based on my, it comes from one chapter, actually the last chapter of the book, which focuses on mourning and memory, collective memories of the Wuhan lockdown. And much of the chapter is about the death of Dr. Li Wenliang. So Dr. Li Wenliang, after he died on February the 7th, 2020, he was celebrated as a national hero. He was called, you know, celebrated as a brave whistleblower. Although, you know, he denied, he didn't think of himself as a whistleblower. He said he just shared some information with his friends on WeChat. He didn't think that way, but he was celebrated as such by ordinary people on Chinese social media. And if you look at all that stories, personal narratives, personal chat about Li Wenliang, a lot of that discourse was about how what an ordinary person Dr. Li was. He was just like any one of us, you know, and yet he can be such an extraordinary person as well. So I think people were saying, a lot of people see themselves in the vulnerability of, you know, their own vulnerability was like the vulnerability of Dr. Li Wenliang. But they also see that, you know, an ordinary person like Dr. Li, who liked to post, let's say, photos of his meals on social media, you know, very funny and humorous. You know, he was, again, he talked a lot. He posted a lot on his Weibo, and people just scrolled through his Weibo postings and thought, what a lovely and ordinary person. And then he could be such a, you know, such a great hero. I think that's something, that's a really very powerful statement for me, in the sense that people were seeing in a very ordinary person extraordinary kind of behavior. In other words, ordinariness, which we tend to take for granted, our ordinary life, people around us, that's life as usual, right? Our everyday habit. We get up, do this, we do that. We get sick, we try to get well. We, you know, all these ordinary things happening on a daily basis. Suddenly, in this kind of discourse, took on some special significance. It became extraordinary. I think that was also kind of unintentional, but self-celebration, I think, of the Wuhan people, of how they were managing the difficulties and hardships of the lockdown in that period of time. They were suffering the similar kind of difficulties as Dr. Li Wenliang, except that Dr. Li unintentionally, you know, exposed himself without being aware of it, and paid you know, for that with his own life. But again, he sacrificed his life for the sake of his family and his friends. So that was extremely moving story. And when I read that kind of story, I felt that we should tell this with this kind of stories are the stuff of history, are the stuff that should be in history, but does not often appear in official history books. So that's why I really, the whole book, I try to tell one story after another of ordinary people from Wuhan.
This is terrific. Maybe to push deeper into the relationship between individual and group emotion, we might take a slightly different angle, which is to talk about the narrative form that you ended up focusing on, which were these lockdown diaries. And, it really struck me that, diaries have sort of two aspects, right? They're narratives that we write, but they're usually private, at least my sense of what diaries are. And maybe that's Western centric, I'm not sure, but I normally think about diaries as private record. And yet what was so interesting about the diaries that you were looking at is that they were actually, public, not just publicized, but on social media, really making them incredibly widely accessible. So my question to you is, maybe elaborate a little bit more on the emotional impact of the public sharing of these lockdown diaries on social media had, both for their authors, who clearly made a deliberate decision to publicize what would normally be private thoughts, but then also for their audiences, which I think you've already touched upon a little bit, how the kind of communal sharing of these individual stories affected society, Chinese society more broadly. So getting a little bit into the sociology of emotion.
Sure, Pete. So this, I think the lockdown diary was one of the remarkable aspects of the Wuhan lockdown period. Later on, we have seen pandemic diaries being produced all over the world, and more recently in Shanghai. But no, only in Wuhan did we see such large volumes of diary writing, and also diary writing that persisted for the duration of the 76 lockdown period. In Shanghai, for instance, recently, we didn't see many diary posting at all in the early period of lockdown. And only, I think, after the Shanghai situation became more of a serious crisis did we begin to see some diary posting. And those diary postings were not kind of daily posting. People suddenly posted, let's say in early April, people in Shanghai, some people began to post diaries that they had written in March. A week or 10 days of diaries posted as one batch. That was very different from the diary posting practice in Wuhan. In Wuhan, diary entries were posted every day. According to some diary scholars, a diary has to be posted. A diary has to be a piece of writing, a daily record, a series of daily records. If you write a diary entry for one day and stop writing, that's not a diary, that's a relic. If you have to post it one day after another for at least for some days consecutively. So when Wuhan residents began to post diaries, they were very conscious of why they were doing this. Some of them wrote explicitly about why they were writing diaries, first of all. And I quoted some of this in my book. Many of them felt that this was such an extraordinary event. I had to document the experience. This is not only personal experience, but it would be important historical experience. There's somehow extraordinary awareness of the historical significance of that event from the very beginning. So that's one kind of consideration from some diarists. Many people really started writing as a way of managing personal life on a daily basis. That's the original intention, one of the original functions of diary writing. Diary writing as a daily practice was really a kind of daily regimen to manage our lives, whether it was in the 18th century, 19th century, or 21st centuries. Diary writing has that very important function. It is to manage your personal life by meticulous, again, some people documenting the personal life in very meticulously, others in very concise, brief terms. But that kind of documentation is a way of sorting out your emotions, sorting out your thoughts, planning the future, tomorrow, next day, next week. It's a daily account of your activities, and it's a way of self-management. This became particularly important in a time of crisis like the lockdown, because there were so many uncertainties. So that's an important function. And related this was, of course, it was a way of managing your emotions, because there was and still, right, so many complex emotions, anxiety, fear, complex emotions, ups and downs, mood swings. You write down, you write about this in your diary, and that also helps you to sort out your feelings. That's another part of this. But very importantly, of course, these diaries, unlike many diaries in the past, were shared on social media, and I think you may feel like this is rather surprising, but it is in one sense. As you said, diaries used to be private, but it is also not surprising in the sense that we've been doing this all the time since social media became part of our life, because our daily social media postings are a sort of diary posting, because we post we write about, we share with friends and strangers, right? Very personal things and feelings that we used to write about only in our private diaries. We've been sharing them on social media for a long time. So in that sense, it's not surprising either. But the sharing, as you suggested, hinted really, is important in the sense that it has important social functions, both for the diary writers themselves and for those who read or viewed their diaries. I mean, viewed meaning there are also some video diaries. They are important for the authors themselves, in the sense that there was usually a lot of feedback from the readers in various kind of in various forms, likes, right? It's the social media practice of interaction. That kind of interaction in a time of isolation, in a life of quarantine, can be empowering for the individuals, for the individual authors. But of course, there were unintended consequences as well, and we can talk about this later, because the most famous diary writer, 𝗱𝗲𝘁, got attacked for her diary. So there was important impact, very meaningful for the authors themselves, but also meaningful for the readers, in the sense that readers found in these diaries experiences similar to theirs. So you get a sense of identification. And whenever we find, experiences similar to ours or different from us, it's a kind of both. It's a means of connection, right? We feel connected with others, But in other times, we feel that our horizon broadens a little bit because we see, wow, this person is managing his or her daily life somewhat differently from my own, right? And there are things I can learn from these people. And these are details that some diarists wrote about. They learned by reading, they learned from other diaries, and they also, I think, derived kind of emotional strength from these. And in addition, diary communities appeared, in a very loose, sense, because whether people posted their diaries on WeChat public account or on Weibo, um, if there are a lot of followers and people shared comments, sometimes the readers themselves started interacting, and there was a sense of at least temporary episodic diary community, which again was very important. The kind of to have a sense of community in a time of lockdown and isolation was really important at that time. So yeah, it's extremely important. Diary writing, extremely important part of the experience. That's why I wrote. I have one chapter on diary writing.
Yes, and just to follow up, you mentioned 𝗱𝗲𝘁, and I think maybe just another minute or two, your thoughts on how the 𝗱𝗲𝘁 example gets at the issue of which audience you share with matters and why. Because as you write in the book, 𝗱𝗲𝘁, who is a tremendous writer, and her diary, was just captivating. She had a huge number of followers within China initially, but once she decided to have it translated into English and published into English, there were a lot of her supporters who became her critics, arguing that in effect she would be basically, hanging China's dirty laundry in public. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts on both that issue of the publics in the plural, and also what her sad circumstance tells us about the nature and prevalence of nationalism in China.
Sure. Yeah, 𝗱𝗲𝘁's diary posting during the lockdown was a phenomenon of great importance. Really, I think important case study in multiple senses. I think we should. I guess I will start by saying that 𝗱𝗲𝘁. I don't think 𝗱𝗲𝘁 anticipated the kind of response her diary would incur toward the later period of lockdown. And it's difficult to anticipate, I suppose, but like all of us who are regular social medias and regular users of social media, she probably was prepared. When we post something, despite the platform, whether it was a small public or bigger smaller circles on WeChat or bigger unknown publics on Weibo, we have to understand that it's once you post there, it's out of your control, right? Because even if you posted within a small WeChat circle like Dr. Li Wenliang, people could take a screenshot of your posting and post it in other places out of your control, and you never know what kind of response you might incur. And 𝗱𝗲𝘁 didn't expect that her diaries would become that popular either. When she started writing, she just she did so because she's a famous novelist, an editor friend suggested, well, maybe you could write something about experience, daily experience, and then she decided to do that, and in a very kind of informal, casual way, posting. Not immediately after the lockdown, actually several days after the lockdown. She was not among the first to post diaries, but she's a great writer. She's a novelist. She knows how to she's a wordsmith, right? She can write in very powerful ways. So very soon her diaries became almost like a cultish. She accumulated a large following. I was among the following. I follow her diaries very closely, and many others as well. And to the extent that it became a daily ritual for many people. And I wrote about this in the book as well, because her diaries, many of her entries were censored, and I don't know, for whatever reason, maybe her writing habit. She wrote at night and usually posted the diary entries at midnight, after midnight, sometimes 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. So her followers, her fans, would be waiting at night for her to post her diaries and read their diary and posting that day before they went to bed. And a lot of them talked about this is after a while became my daily ritual. I can't go to bed. I can't go to sleep without reading Fang's diary. It's that kind of powerful, almost created a kind of social solidarity, or you might say even imagined community, right? Through the reading of her diaries. It's more than just nationally, because I know there are students, people in the diaspora like me. We were following her diary writing as well from outside of China. The kind of shift happened, I think, in response to geopolitical conditions, you might say. That's what she didn't anticipate, because and we didn't anticipate either that very soon in mid-March, we in Philadelphia had our own lockdown, and the pandemic became a global pandemic. And with that, we remember now the initial wave of anti-Chinese, anti-Asian racism, hate speech, including politicians in speaking in the media, demanding reparations from China, things like that. That kind of discourse became, I think, a major factor in triggering rising wave of patriotism, or you might say nationalism, or COVID nationalism in China. It's at that moment when, as you said, Fang's diary became an issue for a lot of people on social media, because people felt, well, yeah, this is the dirty laundry of your family. Why would you, why would you have an English translation and German translation of the book published right in the middle of this this kind of situation? That was, I think, he didn't anticipate it, but of course it wasn't his fault at all, because she wrote her diary as a record of her life and her personal thoughts and feelings, but some her critics felt that she was too critical of the situation in Wuhan, and she was too critical of the local government's handling of the situation. Fang kept defending herself all the way to the end, but of course that she was just caught in between this difficult. I think there was a polarization in the second part of the lockdown in Wuhan. She was caught in between.
Yeah. I have two more fairly big questions, and so I'm hoping you can sort of take them on briefly so that we have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. The first is, you talk a lot about what you translate as formalism. I think it's 形式主义. And you also talk a lot about appearances, sort of 表面, I guess. In fact, I'm going to quote you here. Quote, "An obsession with appearance is endemic to CCP politics and bureaucracy." Could you elaborate a little bit on that, the role of a focus on appearances, formalism, and how that may have contributed to the early sequence of events in Wuhan, which led to an outbreak of COVID becoming an epidemic across the country?
Sure. Yes, appearance. There is a politics of appearance. There is also a personal politics or personal aesthetics of appearance. Appearance matters in every way, for ourselves, for our everyday life, for nations, for governments, for citizens as well. Appearance, but because nowadays, especially in the media age, everything almost becomes appearance. Appearance matters. The thing is that in politics and policy making, when too much is focused on appearance and form at the expense of what actually is going to be achieved, that can come at high cost. And political scientists, who study China, have actually written quite a bit about issues related to formalism and appearance. Formalism is, as you said, 形式主义 is the curse of bureaucracy everywhere, not just in China, in everywhere. Every bureaucracy has its, it's basically blind following of rules, and sometimes the rules don't make sense, but you just follow them. But in Chinese politics, formalism has long been a serious issue, and the party, the CCP itself, has been very much aware of it. Mao himself was very much aware of the harms of formalism, but and so the history of the Chinese Communist Party has been a history of fighting formalism, but it's never been very successful, seems to us. In 2020, what we see as manifestations of formalism, and this is something that Fang wrote about as well in her diaries, for which she was criticized, was that early 2020 was a time for celebration. Was the the lockdown happened just before the Lunar New Year, but then in the 2 weeks before that, before the Lunar New Year, in Wuhan and Hubei, the most important political conferences for the province and for the municipal party committee were convened in those 2 weeks. National, CPC conferences, People's Congress, right? National People's Congress. This is the provincial level and municipal level. So those conferences, annual congresses, were traditionally time for celebration, for summarizing your achievements, for looking forward. Fang wrote that she, as a ex-delegate to People's Congress, she was a delegate herself, so she participated in this kind of conferences herself in early on, before retirement. This was a time when basically the bureaucracy stopped working, and certainly they were not reporting any negative news, and all the attention was focused on the achievements of the past year and celebrating those achievements. So that's the period when I think there are a lot of stories already, media stories, which I think I cited a lot in my chapter, which reported that the health commission in Wuhan and Hubei did not seem to be consistently or coherently reporting the situation of at that time was still uncertain situations of the epidemic. There were case fluctuations. There were, and there were days when there were no briefings. So that was considered, I think, by many observers as very puzzling behavior. And Fang's theory, I think, from her diary was that, it's understandable if you know the history of this kind of congresses. That's not the time for reporting negative news.
Yeah. Guobin, this has been terrific. We're sort of running out of time. I'm going to ask just one last question and ask you to actually speculate extremely briefly on the future, which none of us academics tend to enjoy doing. But given your study of what happened in Wuhan with the lockdowns, what is your best guess as to what we should expect in the future in terms of zero COVID going forward? Should we expect the policy to remain relatively unchanged in the short to middle term, meaning that we should expect to see lockdowns in Shanghai, Beijing, and elsewhere for, again, the short and intermediary future?
Pete, it's very difficult to make any predictions of any kind, but particularly difficult to make predictions about a pandemic, about COVID, because the virus itself mutates in so many unpredictable ways. So what I could say is that our current focus attention is about whether or not on how long China will stick to its zero COVID policy. About a week ago, here at Penn, at our Center for the Study of Contemporary China, we held a conference, basically a book launch conference. We have we edited a book on the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. And that's one issue that came up. I think my understanding of the discussions at the conference, we didn't discuss this COVID policy specifically, but it came up in our conversations. I think the sense is that all attention in China now is on the 20th Party Congress, which is going to happen later this year. And no one is expecting any change in this zero COVID policy before then. Because again, you might say this is another form of formalism. Everything now, the top priority is the successful convening of the 20th Party Congress. Is going to be so important, right? In so many ways, I'm not going to go into that. So probably we won't expect any change. I certainly hope that there will be more kind of flexible policy. We see this from the residents in Shanghai. I've been following Shanghai lockdown, not as much as I wished, but I followed the diaries again, and the people who wrote in their diaries in Shanghai, I think what they were saying, the message that conveyed was that this is different from Wuhan in 2020, right? We now know more about the virus. We now have vaccines. We now have new variants which are more infectious, and we should probably be more flexible and creative in coming up with ways of dealing with the virus. I certainly hope that will probably, after the 20th Party Congress, there could be some change. But again, I don't think I want to make any prediction.